Hey everyone, and welcome to this explainer. Now, when most of us think of a honeybee, we tend to picture just one standard yellow and black bug, right? A bee is just a bee. Well, looking specifically at India reveals a surprisingly diverse and honestly completely fascinating world of honeymakers. We're going to shatter that misconception today. Let's unpack the incredible variety of species native to the subcontinent and see how their wildly different behaviors shape everything from local ecosystems to commercial apiculture. Okay, let's dive into this. The sheer diversity here is just mind-blowing. In India alone, we aren't just looking at one monolithic type of honeybee. We've got several distinct species that vary wildly in size, behavior, and honey output. I mean, we're talking giant, ferocious bees that build towering open combs on cliffsides, all the way down to tiny, almost microscopic bees that don't even have a stinger. Each of these species has carved out a very specific, unique ecological niche across the subcontinent, from the dense forests and high mountains right down to the sprawling plains. So, here's our roadmap for today. 1. The untameable wild bees. 2. The domesticated hive builders. 3. The tiny stingless wonders. And 4. Comparing yields and impact.
All right, jumping into part 1, the untameable wild bees.
The contrast in how these creatures build is absolutely remarkable. On one hand, you have the massive open comb of the rock bee, also known as Apis dorsata. These wild giants construct a single, open comb that can literally be 3 to 6 feet long. You'll find them hanging from high branches, sheer rocks, or even tall city buildings. Now, contrast that with the neat, contained, domesticated hive box on the other side. The rock bee absolutely cannot be tamed or put into a box like that. They are notorious for their ferocity. Seriously, they will launch unprovoked and sometimes even fatal mass attacks on anyone who gets too close. Plus, they're nomads. They frequently migrate and change locations, making them basically impossible to pin down for commercial rearing. But hey, wild doesn't always mean giant. Enter the little bee, or Apis florea. This is the absolute smallest of the Apis species. We're talking only about 5 millimeters long. Instead of those towering massive hives, they build just a single vertical comb that's about the size of the palm of your hand. You'll usually spot these hanging from shrubs, twigs, and hedges pretty close to the ground. Because they produce very little honey and have a habit of constantly changing their nesting place, beekeepers generally consider them unrearable. They're true plains dwellers too. You'll rarely find them in hills above 450 meters. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the little bee's totally unique defense mechanism. Because they nest so close to the ground, they're highly vulnerable to predators, particularly weaver ants. So, to protect themselves, they literally manufacture adhesive, sticky barriers to block the ants from marching into their hive. No way, right? And if that fails, the entire colony works together to create a unified hissing noise, which is actually loud enough for human ears to detect. It is essentially a tiny buzzing burglar alarm, a completely brilliant evolutionary adaptation. Moving right along to section 2, the domesticated hive builders. So this architectural difference we've been talking about, it's the entire foundation of commercial apiculture. Why can we keep some bees happily in boxes but not others? Well, it entirely comes down to behavior and architecture. Wild bees, as we saw, are aggressive, build single open combs, and are prone to absconding, which just means they abandon their hives frequently. Domesticated bees, on the other hand, naturally seek out dark cavities to build their nests. Think hollow logs or caves. And more importantly, they build multiple parallel combs rather than just one giant one. They're also way more docile. This specific set of natural behaviors perfectly aligns with the artificial, mobile wooden frame boxes we use for beekeeping. A perfect example of this is the native Indian honeybee, Apis cerana. They naturally construct these beautiful, multiple parallel combs. Because of this, they are the primary native bee used for beekeeping across India. Interestingly enough, there are 2 distinct morphotypes of this bee, adapted to totally different environments. You've got the black hills bee and the yellow plains bee. And because they build parallel combs and naturally prefer to store their honey at the very top of their colony, beekeepers can cleverly design boxes with a dedicated honey chamber at the top. This makes extracting the honey incredibly easy and safe for everyone involved. But there's another major player in India's domesticated bee scene, the European bee, or Apis mellifera. Now, this bee isn't native to India at all. It was actually imported in the second half of the 20th century. You might be wondering, why import bees? Well, a devastating disease called the thigh sac brood virus was just ripping through native Indian bee colonies, severely destroying them. The European bee was brought in as a sort of reinforcement to help stabilize the industry. They're a bit larger than the native Indian bees. They also naturally build parallel combs in dark cavities, and they are incredibly efficient honey producers. They thrive especially well in the northern regions of India, where they're absolutely vital pollinators for massive agricultural crops like mustard and sunflower. Okay, on to section 3, which features perhaps the most surprising character yet, the tiny, stingless wonders. Meet the dammer bee. These guys belong to the stingless bee subfamily Meliponinae. As you can guess, they are incredibly tiny, under 5 millimeters long. But the real shocker is right there in their classification. They are literally stingless. Over evolutionary time, their stingers became highly reduced and completely useless for defense. So how on earth do they protect their precious honey? Well, they swarm intruders and deliver a surprisingly painful bite with their mandibles. It's a hilarious and brilliant paradox of nature, a bee that bites instead of sting.
And their architectural style is just as unique as their defense strategy. Unlike the neat hexagonal parallel wax combs of the domesticated bees we just looked at, dammer bees build highly irregular combs. They don't just use pure wax either. They mix wax with resinous substances gathered from trees to build these intricate, almost alien-looking structures. They stuff them inside tight crevices, hollow tree trunks, or even artificial boxes. So while they can actually be managed and domesticated, their whole setup and output is completely different from their larger cousins.
Finally, let's bring it all together in section 4, comparing yields and impact. And this brilliantly illustrates exactly what we've been talking about. Look at the massive disparities in annual honey yield per colony. At the very top, you have the giant wild rock bee and the imported European bee, both capable of churning out a massive 25 to 40 kilos of honey every single year. In the middle is the native Indian bee, yielding a very respectable 3 to 9 kilos. And way down at the bottom, we have the little bee producing maybe half a kilo, and the tiny dammer bee yielding a mere 100 grams of honey per year. To put that into perspective, 100 grams is just a few spoonfuls. So the crucial point is this: it's not just about how much honey they make, it's heavily about how they build. The wild rock and little bees construct single, open combs and simply cannot be domesticated. The Indian and European bees build multiple parallel combs in dark spaces, making them the perfect candidates for human domestication. And the dammer bee builds those irregular resinous combs and, despite its tiny yield, can still be managed. Ultimately, comb structure directly dictates our entire relationship with these amazing insects.
But before we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a thought that goes far beyond jars of honey. Whether a colony yields a whopping 40 kilos or a measly 100 grams, every single one of these species, from the ferocious giant rock bee hanging off a cliff down to the tiny stingless dammer bee tucked inside a tree crevice, plays a vital, totally irreplaceable ecological role as a pollinator. Together, they support entire forests, vast agricultural plains, and complex ecosystems. So ask yourself, what happens to our diverse natural ecosystems and our agricultural food supply if even one of these unique honey neighbors disappears? Thanks so much for exploring this with me today. See you next time.